published with Cambridge University Press in 2022, is an interdisciplinary case study that explores the relationship between ritual life, collective consciousness, and maroon before the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. She's currently developing a second project that explores enslaved women's power, reproduction, and resistance in 18th century British and French Caribbean colonies. And this focus on gender and embodied knowledge. We also have somebody here from the Body History Workshop or Working Group, so very warm welcome to you as well. It's something that's very close to my research, but also the research of Claudia, who's also here, so very warm welcome to you as well. We're very much looking forward to listening to your talk entitled Black Women and Reproductive Resistance in the Atlantic World. The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here on this very warm day, beautiful day. It's such a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm honored to be a part of the Joseph Miller Lecture Series. And I especially want to thank Janine Bischoff, John Horber, and Julia Vinter, and the Center for Dependency and Slavery Studies for arranging this visit for me to come and share and discuss some of the beginning ideas that I have for a project on Black women's reproductive resistance in the Atlantic. So first I'll start with just explaining a little bit about how I came to this subject. As a Black Studies historical sociologist, my approach combines my longstanding interest in anti-capitalist Black feminism with historical research on enslaved resistance across the African diaspora. So way back when I was a late undergraduate, early graduate student, I was initially very interested in women's contributions to the Haitian Revolution, especially focusing on Cécile Fatiman, who was a Vodou Mambo priestess who directed the Bois-Cayman ritual ceremony that preceded this August 1791 uprisings. But as I began to try to explore women's roles in the Haitian Revolution, I found that there were very few rebel women who were identified by name in the existing literature. So then I instead focused on the African-based sacred rituals and maroon resistance that cultivated collective consciousness, which became the subject of my dissertation and first book. However, some of the archival research findings did uncover women's resistance within the realm of family and reproduction. So analysis of runaway advertisements showed that compared to men, women's marronage was a key to cultivating community networks of solidarity and resistance through their ties to kin, free people of color, and other enslaved or maroon communities to aid their escape. Secondly, and I'll discuss this in a little bit, women in Haiti's Maniel Maroon community had more children than enslaved women, whose fertility was detrimentally impacted by strenuous labor, violence, disease, and premature death. So these insights about Black women's past and even present struggles to attain reproductive autonomy, to preserve kinship, and to reject the violent terms of racial capitalism inform the basis of this project. So overall, I'm also animated by and inspired by Black feminist theories that emphasize capitalism's triple oppression of Black women. So I think of and with radical activists like the Combahee River Collective, the Third World Women's Alliance, Angela Davis, and Claudia Jones to conceptualize the unique potential of Black women's organizing to dismantle systems of oppression. So while Marxist feminists have long suggested that capitalism does exploit white women's domestic labor, this also may hide or mistakenly overlook some of the racial and economic differentiation of Black women whose agricultural, domestic, and other low-wage essential labor has also historically enabled white families' wealth accumulation. Rather, Black feminists have pointed out how capitalist plunder of Black labor and bodies, both historically and contemporarily, rest on refusing reproductive autonomy to further render them vulnerable to exploitation. So I'm particularly interested in grappling with what Jennifer Morgan and Elise Weinbaum have recently called reproductive racial capitalism, or the conscription and forced integration of Black women's reproductive capacities into the Atlantic world system via hereditary slavery. So enslavers generally deemed African men to be most suitable for difficult agricultural labor on staple commodity producing plantations. However, high death rates and low birth rates, especially on sugar plantations, often led slave traders to begin to target African women as agricultural laborers and as care providers and domestic workers for white families, as well as to reproduce the institution of slavery itself. When the slave trade was legally abolished in 1808, enslavers increasingly relied on Black women to give birth to enslaved property. Prices for enslaved girls and women were based on speculations about their future capacity to bear children, and colonists used law and custom to align children's slave status with that of their mother to ensure that she would give birth to chattel property regardless of the father's racial identity or status. Again, Jennifer Morgan argues that the 17th century British colonial law, colloquially known as Partus Sequentiventum, was one of the key factors that made Atlantic world slavery different from any other type of slavery in world history. The fact of slavery being an inheritable condition and one that was totally enclosed by race. Similarly, the French Code Noir and the Spanish Siete Partidas policies made African heritage virtually synonymous with slave status and interrupted the human familial connections between enslaved Black women and their children by affirming that the primary relation between them was as property rather than as family. Further, these laws incentivized male slave owners, traders, overseers, and other plantation personnel to rape and impregnate Black women, and then to enslave any resulting children with impunity. So I also draw on the voluminous body of enslaved women's histories of resistance by scholars like Stephanie Camp, Marisa Fuentes, Yuko Miki, Sasha Turner, Vanessa Holden, Aisha Finch, and many others that broaden the scope of subversive activity, from open armed uprisings to the individual day-to-day forms of resistance that included work stoppages, feigning illness, temporary escapes, suicide, fertility control, or subverting and reimagining sites of domination as spaces for reconnection with other bondspeople and spaces for rest and recreation. So indeed, enslaved women reclaim their power in various ways, such as ending pregnancies to deny enslavers access to a future generation of chattel property, removing themselves and their children from plantations to build liberated maroon spaces, and using their sacred knowledge to forge solidarities within resistance communities. So now I'd like to kind of transition to just giving a brief overview of two vignettes from historical fictional works that, in the absence of archival evidence, perhaps illustrate the inner world of enslaved women and girls' experiences with sex, pregnancy, family, and freedom as they navigated the confines of slavery, especially sexual abuse, exploitation and commodification of their bodies, and loss and separation through trafficking and death. Then I'll discuss some of the ways that maybe these experiences help to shed light on and help us better understand enslaved women's positions and decision-making during and after major revolts and conspiracies of the Americas. So Let Us Descend by Jesmyn Ward is a recent book. I think it just came out in maybe 22 or 23. And this book introduces us to Mama Aza, a woman from the Fon Arada Nation who was taken to serve the king of Dahomey as a beto, or what outsiders called an Amazon woman soldier. And these Amazon soldiers, an example is depicted here from Frederick E. Forbes. So the beto originated in the 17th century as elephant hunters, and eventually evolved. They were elephant hunters as well as personal security for the king of Dahomey, and eventually evolved into a full-fledged military wing. So the beto were not to take husbands or bear children, And while there exists very little documented evidence that any of these Amazon women soldiers were actually sold into slavery, Jesmyn Ward imagines that the sexual transgressions of partnering and bearing a child and becoming pregnant were the causes for Mama Aza to have been one of the 1.5 million souls exiled from the Bight of Benin. So Aza arrives to South Carolina, one of the major hubs of the North American slave trade, while pregnant with her daughter, Sasha. For Africans involuntarily brought to the Americas, such as Mama Aza, the differences between the nature of personhood, slavery, identity, violence, power, gender, politics, and even childbirthing would have been disorienting at a minimum, and at most, a cause to try to return their spirit to the old world through suicide. Sasha describes Mama Aza's traumatic introduction into the so-called New World, saying, quote, "This place, these people, this world was new to her. She ain't know how to move through it, didn't know the order of things." Mama Aza's life at the Bight of Benin was not perfect, and her world, quote, "wasn't a perfect world, but it wasn't so wrong as this one." Yet Aza manages to teach her daughter Sasha important lessons about fighting for survival by passing down her knowledge of hand-to-hand combat and herbal medicine knowledge that she gained from the indigenous peoples of the Carolinas. Sasha, in turn, imparts this wisdom to her daughter Eddins, who is a product of rape during their nighttime petit marronage into the woods. After Aza dies, Eddins and Sasha are sold separately from South Carolina to New Orleans as part of the internal slave trade. Eddins evokes the memory of her grandmother Aza for strength and wisdom, and is frequently visited by her spirit. So in Let Us Descend, Mama Aza appears as two versions. As Eddins' maternal grandmother who survived the Middle Passage to South Carolina, and as a symbolic representation of the Yoruba Orisha Oya, whose mysterious guidance and advice both helps and frustrates Eddins on her journey to New Orleans and on her eventual journey to reclaiming, liberating, and defining herself. So Eddins lands at a New Orleans sugar plantation where people are starved, overworked, and violently punished for the slightest infractions. And after she's punished with isolation in a dungeon, Eddins then learns that maroons live on the outskirts of the plantation near the swamps and begins a romantic with one maroon man named Bastien. During a storm, Aza tells Eddins to flee, and she manages to escape while also realizing that she's pregnant with Bastien's baby. So by the end of the book, Eddins realizes that Mama Aza's spirit also struggled over the meaning and significance of her own motherhood in a world where Black women's connection to their children was always vulnerable to separation, sale, or death. Aza wanted to be the mother of the women of my line, Anna says. But Eddins insists on delivering herself and her unborn child on her own terms, away from the reach of enslavers, and unbound from the unfreedoms of the old world as well as the new. The infamous Rosalie by Haitian writer Evelyn Trujillo relays a raw portrayal of the reality of colonial Haiti from the perspective of a precocious enslaved adolescent girl named Lisette. Lisette's story begins with during the famed Maroon Mackendall's poison campaign that aimed to kill the white plantation owners of Haiti's northern plain. After Mackendall was captured and executed in 1758, planters' paranoia about poisonings and marronage led to a wave of torture and brutal executions that they unleashed on enslaved people who were accused of taking part in the poison conspiracy. Lisette is haunted by memories of the Middle Passage that she inherited from her mother, grandmother, and other Fawn Arada women, while she continually contends with the loss of peers and acquaintances who often were transient members of the slave community, arriving to Haiti from Africa and then disappearing within a short time frame. Lisette is not only keenly aware of the widespread repression against Black rebels like Mackendall, She herself acted as a go-between, relaying messages or food between bondspeople on plantations and those living as maroons on plantation outskirts. She, like the protagonist of Let Us Descend, also becomes intimately involved with a young maroon man named Vincent, with whom she takes brief breaks from her plantation duties to spend fleeting moments of tenderness in the woods. By the end of the infamous Rosalie, Lisette finds herself overwhelmed by the constant deaths of those around her, and she is certain that death will soon visit upon her as well. As she recalled stories of her grandmother and godmother's survival of the Middle Passage from the Bight of Benin, Lisette also learned of her great aunt Bridget's work as a midwife who aborted 70 babies. And I'll just kind of briefly mention that historically there actually was a woman who was who worked as a midwife and was accused of executing or committing infanticide and was accused of killing that many children, of 70 babies. So that figure and that individual, that person is fictionalized in this account, but was based on a real individual. So no longer content to serve as an enslaved domestic worker, Lisette's pregnancy and desire to embody the freedom that her lover Vincent inspires prompts her to set off as a maroon. And Lisette affirms, quote, "May I find the courage to honor my promise. Creole child who still lives in me, you will be born free and rebellious, or you will not be born at all." So both of these stories show their protagonists taking small and big steps, such as engaging in sexual intimacy of their choosing and becoming maroons, to reclaim control over their bodies, their time, and their journeys toward mothering. These literary insights help to address the archival silences and biases that lack substantive accounts from female Middle Passage survivors or their descendants. The absence of women's perspectives on slave uprisings is also particularly noted due to enslavers' refusal to see African women's agency as legitimate. So West and Central African women's societal roles ranged from soldiers such as Mama Aza to queens, queen mothers, spiritual leaders, landowners, merchants, agriculturalists, and so on. However, the slave trade incentivized a flattening of these roles in political, military, economic, and sacred spheres to an emphasis solely on their sexual, reproductive, and agricultural capacities. Thus, what Hortense Spillers calls the ungendering of African people that happened through the slave trade, I would suggest is not only an ungendering, but an undoing of all categories that did not serve the purposes of enslaving and colonial expansion. Yet the enslaved African and African descended women reclaimed power in formal and informal ways. So thus the challenges of studying enslaved women in resistance kind of urges an attentiveness to the various subversive activities, particularly those that denied enslavers access to and power over their bodies, pregnancies, and children. So for example, when we think about kind of rejecting the commodification of women's lives, their wombs, and their bodies, there's a wide range of literature that I've just mentioned that show that some women attempted to manage their fertility by prolonging breastfeeding of their children as a form of birth control. When enslaved women across the Americas decided to not have children, rather than to see them become part of the plantation system, they employed African midwives' knowledge of herbs and plants to create medicines that would induce abortion or infanticide. Some women used legal and extra-legal means to preserve the kinship ties that were deeply fractured by the indiscriminate buying and selling upon people across geographies. Here I'm thinking of Jessica Johnson's work in Wicked Flesh, where she explores kind of using the legal system to maintain some of these connections. And then in other cases, women wrested control over their lives by escaping plantations, at times with their children, in search of better living conditions in self-liberated communities of runaways. But it's also important to maybe complicate this picture, and some of the cases and stories that I'll share in a bit, I think will also help to maybe nuance this argument. Because enslaved women's concerns overlapped with, but then at times countered the aims of militaristic armed insurgency that is most often associated with Maroon wars and slave conspiracies, uprisings, and revolutions, events in which few women were named as leaders or participants. Yet, women indeed engaged in these activities, though perhaps in fewer numbers, or with less visibility than their male counterparts. But regardless of their level of participation, as work by Aisha Finch and Vanessa Holden show, women were nonetheless part of the enslaved communities that conceptualized and strategized rebellions, bore witness to the revolts, and experienced the brutal repression that followed. Alternatively, the work of Marjorie Tars and Jessica Johnson demonstrate that uprisings at times had deleterious effects on enslaved women and children, some of whom sought refuge from dangerous conflict or were further displaced as an inadvertent result of rebellion. So the extent and nature of enslaved women's resistance during revolts and conspiracies not only varied across time and space, in the most practical sense, we can say that they likely varied from individual woman to individual woman. Nonetheless, gender shaped enslavers' narratives about these incidences and shaped their imaginaries about how to potentially prevent them. Rebelliousness was largely associated with masculinity, while women were seen as having allegiance to their owners and willingness to divulge information or rumors that they overheard due to being situated within or near insurgent networks. So for example, in the 1736 Antigua conspiracy, some women cooperated with authorities against the rebels. On the other hand, there were also a few women of the Akan nation from the Gold Coast region, present-day Ghana, who were recognized and described as being queens within the rebels' sacred spaces. Yet, as Barry Gasper notes, none of those women were actually arrested or deported or considered to be members of the conspiracy because enslavers could not see or comprehend queenship as a valid form of African women's power. In the Stono Rebellion of 1739, South Carolina, similarly, no women were described as insurgents, and one unnamed woman who was owned by Thomas Rose was rewarded for her role in suppressing the uprising. In the uprising's aftermath, the House of Commons recommended that the colony increase its militia presence according to the number of enslaved men on the plantations. So again, here gender is very much a part of the way that enslavers and colonists are kind of responding to these uprisings. So even though early slave traders prioritized male captives to comprise these work gangs, colonial plantation authorities also sought to increase women's presence as a complicit or pacifying force for enslaving. So for example, in several colonies, including 16th century Hispaniola or Santo Domingo, African women were brought in as slaves because African men wanted wives. And enslavers believed that having wives and families would prevent men from escaping as maroons and rebelling. Yet, as I'll discuss shortly, many women and their children escaped alongside men to maintain their familial bonds, even in moments of upheaval. So enslavers often couched this familial connection between women and men maroons within the framework of kidnapping. Male maroons were believed to pillage plantations in search of food, weapons, money, clothing, and women. And while some of these women may have been previously connected to the maroon men, others indeed may have been legitimately abducted by men who were foreign to them and thus considered threatening. For example, an enslaved Haitian woman named Anne was rewarded for cooperating with authorities to capture the maroon Cabinda, whom had stolen her and married her against her will. This exertion of control over women, including from bondsmen and maroons, was according to Marjolein Pars, part of why some women's responses to revolt was to dodge conflict of any kind. So for example, we see in this broadside summarizing the 1692 Barbados conspiracy that alleged that colony-born male rebels wanted to enslave the new Africans and subjugate the Black and white women. So it's difficult also to distinguish between the validity of these accusations that rebel bondsmen were kidnapping women or that they wanted to replace white men, and the degree to which these were actually perhaps just enslavers' projection of their own violent behavior. Moreover, fear, torture, and violent interrogations were primary tools that drove the discovery and accounting of these conspiracies. So again, you know, part of what I might hope to do in this project is kind of parse out like what does patriarchy mean in this context for both African and European societies, and how does that maybe interface, or how does that interface in a case like this, for example? So as appears evident from these anecdotes, women who cooperated and were rewarded for cooperation seem to be much more readily identifiable than women who were part of the rank and file or even leadership of resistors. Again, both Jennifer Morgan and Aisha Finch attribute cooperation to women's attempt to protect the enslaved community from the inevitable violent repression that occurred in the wake of rebellion. So it's important to try to make sense of and contextualize both African men and women's actions before, during, and after insurgency, and to do so without pathologizing or romanticizing them. So for example, the idea of Black women's acquiescence to the plantation power structures has long been legitimized by the film industry's portrayal of the mammy, a domestic worker whose proximity to and intimate care for the slave-owning family engendered a sense of connection to them at the expense of her loyalty to the enslaved community of which she was a part. These ideas no doubt influenced 20th century stereotypes of a so-called Black matriarchy, particularly those that appeared in the infamous Department of Labor report by Daniel Moynihan. And so in Angela Davis's foundational essay, Reflections on the Black Women's Role in the Community of Slaves, she's directly speaking against Moynihan's report and this kind of widespread, widely believed idea of the existence of a Black matriarchy within Black American communities. And also a Black matriarchy that, again, is complicit with white supremacy. And so in this essay, she enumerates the various ways that enslaved women contributed to quotidian acts of insurgency. In turn, enslavers' counter-insurgent acts were similarly quotidian and escalated to extreme acts of repression, such as hangings and burning rebels alive. But Davis argues that sexual abuse compounded physical violence. It was not only a tool to impose pregnancy on enslaved women, but was a form of counterinsurgency to repress enslaved women's influence in the domestic sphere, to ingratiate feelings of shame and discord among enslaved men and women, and to undermine the social reproduction of resistance in slave communities. Thus, if slavery was war, as Vincent Brown suggests, then rape was also an act of war. As Davis states, as a direct attack on the Black female as a potential insurgent, this sexual repression finds its parallel in virtually every historical situation where the woman actively challenges oppression. Jean-Philippe Garand de Colon's An Inquiry into the Causes of the Insurrection of the Negroes of the Island of Santo Domingo from 1792 similarly cites the, quote, gross violations of female chastity as a key example of the outrages that characterized plantation life in colonial Haiti. He also linked it to a persistent sense of harrowing shame, humiliation, and anger among both enslaved women and men, stating, quote, "In the forcible violation of female chastity, we trace the most detectable extreme of brutality. And in the estimation of sensibility, the loss of life is preferable to its disgrace. Let this account then be settled between the African trader and the imperious planter who compels his embrace, who compels to his embrace the unwilling object of his lust, and the exasperated slave who gratifies by this hateful act not his sensuality but his resentment." Shannon Eves' recent work on slavery rape in the plantation in the antebellum South also shows that the systematic rape of enslaved women had a mental and emotional impact on all members of the enslaved community, including men and children, all of whom were aware of these acts of sexual violence against their wives, their mothers, their sisters, their aunts, daughters, etc. Enslaved men were also at times brutalized so that slave owners could more freely access women, such as in Haiti, where a man named Jacquet was flogged to death so that his wife could be taken. So for Garand de Colon, as well as for C.L.R. James, sexual violence was a factor leading to rebellion. James argued that male rebels fought with the specific consciousness of the violations that enslaved women experienced and sought vengeance for those actions by targeting white women in kind. So given the realities of enslaved women's experiences with sexual violence and acts of coercion, whether by their Black male counterparts or by enslavers, a nuanced examination of plantation rape is necessary to reveal the motivations for and violent nature of uprisings against colonial plantation slavery. So we must then kind of move beyond questions of whether women participated in slave rebellions toward an understanding of their broad experiences during and even after these events. And some of these outcomes were not necessarily always liberatory in the traditional sense. So to capture the breadth of these experiences, Aisha Finch suggests, what might happen if our picture of rebellion, what might happen to our picture of rebellion if scholars saw rape, sexual assault, pregnancy, birth control, and so forth as pivotal to the organization, form, and outcome of slave insurgencies. As we've seen with Mama Aza and Annis in Let Us Descend, or Lisette in the infamous Rosalie, one way to approach this question has been to understand how enslaved women engaged with sex, children, family, and resistance communities on their own terms, which might then constitute a reproductive resistance that countered the exploitative practices of sexual violence. Maroon settlements appear to have been spaces where perhaps not entirely, but maybe in large part absent from sexual assaults of women, and were spaces that allowed women to choose their intimate partners and to become mothers voluntarily. So as I mentioned in the opening, one of the archival sources that I found in the colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence was a roster listing of various Maroon families listed in the treaty between what was called the Manuel Maroon community and the French. And in this roster, again, there are about 133 people named, and they're arranged by household. And so looking at this document, it has at least their first name or what they were being referred to as, the place of their birth, whether they were had been born in Haiti, whether they were African born, or if they were coming from Santo Domingo, the neighboring colony to colonial Haiti, French Saint-Domingue, and their ages, as well as the names and approximate ages of their children. And so one of the things that I was able to do in looking at this document was essentially to calculate the ratio between the numbers of children and the numbers of women who were in this community. And when I did this calculation, I looked back at some secondary literature that had done similar calculations of child to woman ratios on sugar estates, coffee estates, and indigo estates, and essentially found that this ratio between children and women among the Manuel community was twice as high as those for most of the women who were being included in these estate documents. So to me, I felt that this was perhaps a suggestion that women who found haven within these self-liberated spaces were exposed to less violence and willingly gave birth more than women who were bound to plantations, again, whose overall health and well-being was just detrimentally affected, especially African women. For women who had been born in the Haitian colony, their birth outcomes were a little bit higher, so to speak, but for African women, their reproductive outcomes tended to be worse. And so enslaved women's ability and willingness to flee plantations, however, was often complicated by her devotion to children and fear of leaving them to the whims of the plantocracy. So this idea that women did not want to escape because they were too afraid to take their children with them is another kind of theory within some of the existing literature. And so, and some of this is maybe geographically dependent. So for example, in the United States, as Stephanie Camp's work has shown, enslaved women seem to have engaged in short-term escapes, allowing them brief periods of respite from plantation violence, and then returning on their own volition. At the same time, pregnancy and motherhood, again, did not completely preclude enslaved women from taking part in collective uprisings. French Caribbean women's responses to the 1802 expedition of General Victoire Leclerc to restore slavery to after its 1793 abolition further demonstrates their willingness to not only fight for theirs and others' freedom, but to do so on behalf of their families. So again, it's important to note here that even though armed struggle is often characterized as a masculinist practice and perspective, when we return to figures like Mama Aza and other West and Central African women, like the 17th century Queen Njinga, who held political positions and participated in and led military exercises, it becomes apparent that enslaved women rebels were at times at the front lines of insurrection alongside men. Solitude of Guadeloupe is an example of this. She was part of the insurgent camps during the French campaign to restore slavery. According to an early historian of Guadeloupe, Auguste Lacour, she was one of the most fervent advocates for an all-out war against the whites of the island. Lacour described her as a wicked genius who mentally tormented and threatened prisoners in the Dole camp, saying she let out on all occasions her hatred and her fury. She had rabbits. One of them having escaped, she armed herself with a spit, ran, pierced it, lifted it, and presented it to the prisoner, saying, "Here," she said, mixing her words with the most insulting epithets. "This is how I'm going to treat you when the time comes." And this unfortunate woman was going to become a mother. Solitude did not abandon the rebels and remained close to them, like their evil genius, to incite them to the greatest crimes. Finally arrested in the middle of a band of insurgents, she was condemned to death, but the execution of the sentence had to be stayed. She was tortured on November 29th after her delivery. So little else is known about Solitude besides this statement by Lacour. And it's also kind of believed, though, that the mass of cultivators did, in fact, kind of believe or align with her and with her ideas as she is kind of represented here and memorialized in the statue that stands in Port-au-Prince, Guadeloupe, alongside some of the other male leaders of the resistance to the French of 1802. So again, we don't know who might have impregnated Solitude, or if she had been raped or voluntarily partnered. We also know little about Solitude's origins, and if she herself perhaps may have been a product of rape, right? Hence the nickname La Mulatresse. I think it plausible to speculate that this indeed may have been the case, and that perhaps a personal connection with the trauma of rape was a reason for Solitude's resolute attitude toward trying to end white rule of Guadeloupe. So again, here one can only imagine the physical and emotional pain that she endured at the end of her life, delivering and then being immediately separated from a child before a torturous execution. Alternatively, Solitude may have been aware of and willing to accept the deadly consequences of revolt, such as another unnamed rebel woman and her daughters who were captured in Haiti in 1802 during this same campaign and were condemned to death. As they walked together toward their execution, the mother consoled her crying daughters, encouraging them to rejoice, for your wombs will not beget slaves. As the mother of enslaved girls, this unnamed heroine's final declaration illustrated what must have amounted to a life of constant grief, fear, and anger that undoubtedly arose from having little to no protection from sexual violence or control over one's destiny or that of one's children. For her, death meant freedom from her own bondage and from the freedom of reproductive labor, the labor of bringing new life into a world defined by unending work, violence, and death. So this anecdote here reveals that how the formerly enslaved women of colonial Haiti viewed the Haitian Revolution as a source of liberation that would end the reality of slavery and coerced reproduction. So the risk of sacrificing one's life was worth the ability to regain control over the intimacies of mothering and kinship. So the archival silences, again, around women in the Haitian Revolution and of enslaved resistance and insurrection more broadly, requires a careful investigation into African Atlantic histories to restore those women's voices. On the other hand, it's also important to ask other questions about the place of women and children during periods of social upheaval and transformation. For example, several works bring attention to enslaved women and girls' experiences as mothers, as eyewitnesses, as victims, as survivors, and as secret keepers during marronage efforts and other uprisings. So asking this question of how did women and girls cope with trauma, violence, loss, and the structures that commodified them, as well as those that sought to liberate them. Especially when in these afterlives of slave rebellions saw the waves of public horrifying acts of retributive violence that produced fear, mourning, and the quote, tortured process of life making in the aftermath of death, processes that were deeply gendered. One of the most revered Haitian women from the revolutionary era was Marie Sante Dedi Basile, commonly referred to as Défilé La Folle. Dede Basile's story is exemplary of the emotional labor, or what Christina Sharp conceptualizes as the wake work that women performed in the face of revolutions, in the face of the revolution's traumatic and deadly struggle from slavery to freedom. Dede was described as a woman distraught with grief over the brutal assassination and dismemberment of Jean-Jacques Dessalines in 1806. Outraged by the excesses committed on his corpse, she found a sack, loaded it with his bloody remnants, and carried them into the city cemetery. And so you can kind of see in this artistic representation, body parts of his arms, and with the gold and the red, kind of representing some of the clothing that he is often depicted as wearing. So in this political act of recollecting his remains, she symbolically, quote, invites women and men to rebuild society, as Sabine Lamore suggests, which was increasingly fractured by civil war. Dede's allegiance to Dessalines is also represented in religious chants and songs in his honor, as she had been a constant presence in his military camp prior to his betrayal by surrounding officers. In addition to her individual support, Dede lost 2 of her sons and 3 brothers in a massacre by Rochambeau's troops. So the psychological toll of these deaths inflicted earned her the disparaging nickname La Folle, or the Mad Woman, thus marginalizing the value of her life and her political actions. Several sources indicate that she was likely born and enslaved near Cap Français, or what is today Cap Haitian, and died in 1816 at approximately the age of 80, though other details of her origins and early life remain mired in obscurity. Perhaps influenced by nationalist impulses during the US occupation of Haiti, for some Haitian scholars, Dede is elevated to Mother of the Nation because of her great sacrifices. Through her actions and losses, Dede is viewed as a model after whom the women of Haiti should model themselves, a woman who sacrificed herself and either her own children for the sake of birthing and protecting the nation. But this conceptualization of Haitian women as the potomitan, or the strong pillar that upholds her family, community, and broader society, erases the intersectional systems of oppression that engender Haitian women's economic precarity and need for communal support, as again Sabine Lamore argues. Thus, Black studies perspectives on trauma, mothering, loss, and reproductive justice within the context of racial capitalism and colonialism can help us to humanize enslaved women in ways that go beyond traditional conceptions of resistance and revolt. So I'll just conclude by stating that this project is aiming to demonstrate the importance of family, kin networks, and reproductive autonomy to enslaved women's navigation of their social, biological, and political worlds within collective efforts to overthrow or resist bondage. In challenging the confines of the historical archive and expanding the scope of secondary literature, the project aims to illuminate the constraints and the possibilities of enslaved women's resistance and power in subverting the capitalist system of Atlantic slavery that deeply exploited their reproduction. In so doing, perhaps new meanings and new perspectives on revolutions in general can emerge when we have women and family at the center. So I've only recently begun revisiting archives with the hope of building upon my previous work on Haiti and also incorporating insights from rebellions in other French and English colonies. So I'll end there, but I thank you so much again, and I look forward to your questions and suggestions.